Picture this. It is 722 AD and you are a general of the Umayyad Caliphate. You have just conquered the known world from the sands of Arabia to the Atlantic coast. You hold a report in your hand about a group of rebels hiding in a cave in northern Spain. Your scouts tell you they are starving, eating honey from the rocks to survive. You don't order a siege. You don't even order a full battalion. You laugh. You grab your quill and write a phrase that history will never forgive. You call them 30 wild donkeys. You ask your officers, what damage can 30 wild donkeys do to us? That question is your death sentence, because those donkeys are about to lure you into a slaughterhouse known as the Battle of Covadonga, wiping your army off the face of the earth and saving Europe from total conquest. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand why this mistake was so fatal, you have to understand the speed at which the Umayyad war machine was moving. This wasn't a slow expansion, it was a blitzkrieg. In 711 AD, just 11 years prior, Islamic forces crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. They didn't just defeat the Spanish armies, they evaporated them. In one single afternoon at the Battle of Guadalete, the entire Visigothic nobility was decapitated. The king vanished, the generals died, the resistance collapsed. For the Umayyad commanders, this wasn't a war anymore, it was a mopping up operation. They swept north like a wildfire. Cities like Toledo, Seville and Cordoba fell like dominoes. The locals didn't fight back, they opened the gates. The speed was intoxicating. By the time the invaders reached the northern coast, they were convinced that God was on their side and that nothing could stop them. They had crossed mountains, deserts and seas. Why would they worry about a wet, foggy pile of rocks in Asturias? This is where the wild donkeys insult comes from. It wasn't just trash talk, it was a calculation. The Muslim chronicler Al-Makari records this sentiment perfectly. The governor of Al-Andalus looked at the map, saw the tiny pocket of resistance in the Picos de Europa, and did the math. To march an army up those narrow passes would be expensive and annoying. Why bother? Winter is coming. The cold will kill them. Hunger will kill them. If they want to live in a cave like animals, let them die in a cave like animals. But here is the detail the Umayyads missed. They looked at the numbers. 300 men versus an empire of millions. But they ignored the composition of those men. These weren't peasants with pitchforks. These were the survivors of the Visigoth royal guard. They were hardened veterans who had watched their world burn and had retreated to the one place where cavalry couldn't follow. And they were led by a man named Pelayo, who didn't want to survive. He wanted revenge. The Umayyad arrogance created a blind spot. In military history, we see this again and again. It's the same blindness that hit Napoleon in Russia or the Americans in Vietnam. When a superpower faces a guerrilla force, they look for an army to fight. When they don't see an army, they assume there is no threat. The Umayyad generals were looking for a battlefield with open plains where their heavy cavalry could charge. They didn't find one, so they assumed the war was over. They left the north alone, they let the donkeys live, and in doing so, they gave Pelayo the one thing he needed most: time. Time to organise. Time to learn the terrain. Time to turn a group of refugees into a lethal ambush squad. While the Umayyads were busy calculating their taxes and planning the invasion of France, Pelayo was turning the Covadonga Valley into a kill box. The irony is brutal. If the Umayyads had sent just one serious expeditionary force in 718 or 719, they could have crushed the rebellion in an afternoon. They could have ended the Reconquista before it even began. Spain would likely be an Islamic nation today, but they didn't. They were too big, too successful, and too arrogant to care. They allowed the infection to fester because they thought it was benign. So when the order finally came in 722 to deal with the rebels, it was too late. The Umayyad commander Al-Qama marched his massive army into the mountains, expecting a police action. He expected to walk in, accepting a surrender, and walk out. He didn't know he was walking into a geological trap. He didn't know that the wild donkeys had spent years sharpening their hooves. and he certainly didn't know that he was marching 100,000 men into a grave dug by 300 ghosts. The stage was set for the most lopsided, impossible, and violent clash in medieval history. To understand the desperation of the men in the cave, we have to understand what they lost. History often portrays the Islamic conquest of Spain as a military invasion, but that is a half-truth. The fall of Hispania was not a murder, it was a suicide. The Visigoth Kingdom, which had ruled the Iberian Peninsula for 300 years since the fall of Rome, was not destroyed from the outside. It rotted from the inside out. By the year 710, the Visigoth Kingdom was a political shark tank. It was a realm defined by civil war, assassination, and brutal power struggles. There was no hereditary succession. Every time a king died, the nobles fought a battle royale to see who would wear the crown next. It was a system designed for chaos, and in 710, that chaos produced a king named Roderick. Roderick had seized the throne by force, blinding and imprisoning his rivals. He was a warrior, yes, but he was a usurper. Half the country hated him, and in the shadows his enemies were willing to burn the kingdom down just to see him fall. Enter the villain of the piece, Count Julian. Julian was the governor of Ceuta, a fortress city on the North African coast, just across the strait from Gibraltar. He was the gatekeeper of Europe. His job was to stop any invasion from Africa, but Julian had a grudge. According to the most enduring historical accounts, he sent his beautiful daughter to the royal court in Toledo for her education. There, King Roderick saw her, took what he wanted, and dishonoured her. When Julian found out, he didn't demand an apology. He didn't declare war. He quietly made a deal with the devil. Julian approached the rising Muslim commander in North Africa, Musa ibn Nusayr, and his general, Tariq ibn Ziyad. He told them, "I will not only let you pass, I will give you the ships." It is one of history's coldest betrayals. The man paid to lock the door handed the keys to the burglar. In the spring of 711, Tariq ibn Ziyad landed at Gibraltar with 7,000 Berber troops. They were ferried across on Julian's own merchant vessels, disguised to look like a trade convoy. King Roderick was hundreds of miles away in the north, fighting Basque rebels. When he heard the news, he wasn't terrified, he was annoyed. He thought this was just another raid, a looting expedition. He marched south to teach them a lesson, gathering a massive army of 30,000 men. The two forces met at the Battle of Guadalete. On paper, Roderick should have crushed the invaders. He had the numbers, he had the heavy cavalry, but he didn't have loyalty. As the battle raged, the wings of Roderick's army, commanded by the relatives of the king he had usurped, simply stopped fighting. Some sources say they turned and attacked Roderick. Others say they just stood there and watched him die. They thought the Muslims were mercenaries hired to remove Roderick and that they would leave once the job was done. They were wrong, dead wrong. Roderick was killed in the chaos. His body was never found, only his white horse and his golden boots sunken in the mud of the riverbank. With the king dead and the army betrayed, the central nervous system of the Visigoth state collapsed instantly. There was no plan B. There was no heir. The mercenaries didn't go home. They realised the door was wide open, and they walked right through. The speed of the collapse was terrifying. It wasn't a conquest. It was a hot knife through butter. The Muslim armies advanced without supply lines, living off the land, taking city after city. The local population, tired of Visigoth taxes and corruption, mostly shrugged and accepted the new management. The Jews of Spain, who had been brutally persecuted by the Christian Visigoths, often welcomed the Muslims as liberators. Within 2 years, the Visigoth Kingdom was a memory. The nobles who had betrayed Roderick were either executed or stripped of their power. They had sold their country for a throne that no longer existed. This is the world that Pelayo, our protagonist, was living in. He was a high-ranking nobleman, a member of the royal bodyguard, perhaps even a relative of King Roderick. He watched the betrayal at Guadalete. He saw his friends slaughtered, his king vanish, and his country dissolve. He didn't surrender. He retreated north, step by bloody step, as the green tide of the Umayyad Caliphate swallowed everything he knew. By 718, Pelayo wasn't just a refugee, he was a loose end. The conquerors had captured him and dragged him to Cordoba, the new capital, to keep him as a hostage. They wanted to domesticate him, to make him a compliant puppet like the rest of the surviving nobility. But they underestimated him. Pelayo looked at the new masters of Spain and saw only usurpers. He waited for his moment, slipped his chains and ran. He didn't run to France to hide. He ran back to the wildest, hardest place in Spain. He ran to Asturias, and there, in the shadow of the Picos de Europa, he decided to stop running. Pelayo was not born a king. In the aftermath of the collapse, he was a survivor, a man trying to navigate the wreckage of his world. After the fall of the Visigoth Kingdom, the Umayyad strategy shifted from slaughter to consolidation. They needed the local nobility to keep the population in line. So, they took hostages. They took the sons and influential figures of the old regime and brought them to Cordoba. This wasn't a dungeon, it was a gilded cage. Pelayo was kept close to the seat of power, likely serving in some administrative capacity, watched closely by the new emir. But while Pelayo was trapped in the south, a different kind of conquest was happening in his homeland of Asturias. The Muslim governor of the northern province was a man named Munuza. Munuza was not a warrior like the generals who swept through in 711. He was a politician. He preferred diplomacy and strategic marriages over bloodshed. And Munuza had his eyes on a specific prize, Pelayo's sister. Historical accounts vary on the details. Some say her name was Adocinda, some say she was forced, others say it was a political arrangement, but the core conflict is undeniable. Munuza wanted to marry into the old royal bloodline to legitimize his rule. To Pelayo, this was not a marriage, it was the final insult. It was the genetic erasure of his family. It was the conqueror taking the last thing the conquered had left. When news reached Cordoba that Munuza was moving to claim his sister, something in Pelayo snapped. The passive hostage died, and the rebel was born. In 717 AD, he staged a daring escape from Cordoba. We don't have the details of how he slipped past the guards, whether it was bribery, disguise, or violence. But we know he covered nearly 500 miles of hostile territory to get back to the north. He wasn't running to save his own skin, he was running to stop a wedding. He arrived in Asturias too late to stop Munuza's influence from taking root, but just in time to light a fire. Pelayo confronted the governor. This was a moment of incredible danger. He walked into the lion's den and openly defied the representative of the Caliphate. Munuza, likely surprised by the audacity of this fugitive, ordered his arrest. This is where the legend of Pelayo truly begins. He didn't submit, he fought his way out. There is a famous account of Pelayo fleeing across the Pelona River. As Munuza's troops closed in, Pelayo swam the rushing waters, clinging to his horse, while arrows splashed around him. He wasn't just escaping, he was migrating. He was leaving the occupied zone and heading for the only place where the Umayyad horses couldn't follow. He headed for the Picos de Europa. These mountains are not like the rolling hills of England or the flat plains of France. They are a wall of limestone teeth jutting straight up into the sky. They are treacherous, steep, and constantly shrouded in mist. To the locals, they were home. To an army, they were a nightmare. Pelayo didn't go there alone. As he moved through the villages and valleys, a strange thing happened. People began to follow him. These were the wild donkeys the Umayyads would later mock. They were Visigoth nobles who had lost their lands, peasants tired of taxes, and young men who had grown up in the shadow of defeat. They saw in Pelayo something they hadn't seen in a decade, a leader who wasn't afraid. By the time he reached the sanctuary of the mountains, Pelayo had a small ragtag band of followers. They held a council in the shadow of the peaks. It wasn't a coronation in a cathedral with gold and incense. It was a desperate meeting in the mud. There, standing on a pile of rocks, Pelayo was declared princeps, prince. Not king of Spain, but prince of the Asturians. It was a title that meant nothing to the rest of the world. To Munuza, sitting comfortably in his palace in Gijón, it was a joke. A fugitive playing king in the woods, but Munuza made a fatal error. He let Pelayo stay there. He assumed that the cold and hunger of the mountains would do the job of the executioner. He didn't realize that by driving Pelayo into the wilderness, he'd given him the ultimate fortress. For 4 years, from 718 to 722, Pelayo consolidated his power. He wasn't fighting a war yet. He was building a nation in a cave. He was stockpiling weapons, scouting the narrow passes and waiting. He knew the Umayyads would come eventually. He knew they couldn't ignore a rival prince forever, and when they did come, he wouldn't meet them on the open field where they were invincible. He would invite them into his house, into the dark, narrow throat of Covadonga, and he would slam the door shut. If you look at a topographical map of Spain, you will see why the Reconquista took nearly 800 years. The centre of the country is a high, arid plateau, perfect for the movement of large armies, but the north is a fortress built by tectonic plates. The Picos de Europa, or Peaks of Europe, are a jagged mass of limestone rising abruptly from the sea, creating a labyrinth of deep gorges, vertical cliffs and narrow valleys. This is not terrain for horses, it is terrain for mountain goats. The weather here is its own weapon. The Atlantic winds slam into these peaks, creating a perpetual cycle of rain, fog and snow. For an Umayyad soldier raised in the deserts of Arabia or the warm plains of North Africa, marching into Asturias was like marching onto an alien planet. To understand the tactical genius of Pelayo, you have to understand the specific location he chose for his last stand, Covadonga. The name comes from the Latin Cova Dominica, meaning Cavern of the Lady. It is a natural cave carved into the sheer face of a cliff, hovering above a narrow valley where two rivers meet. It is a geographical cul-de-sac, a dead end. To get to the cave, you have to funnel your army through a deep wooded gorge. In military terms, this is what we call a force multiplier. The Umayyad army, commanded by General Alcama, numbered anywhere from 80,000 to 180,000 men. According to Christian chronicles, modern historians suggest a more realistic number, perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 effective combatants. But it didn't matter if Alcama had 10,000 men or 10 million. The valley was so narrow that only a few men could fight abreast at any one time. Think of it like the Battle of Thermopylae, where the 300 Spartans held the hot gates. But Covadonga was even better. At Thermopylae, the Persians could eventually flank the Spartans. At Covadonga, there was no flank. There was only the cliff on one side and the river on the other. The Umayyad numerical advantage was instantly nullified. In fact, their numbers became a liability. A massive army in a narrow gorge is not a force, it's a traffic jam. Pelayo knew that the Umayyad strength lay in their heavy cavalry and their archers, but horses break their legs on these rocks. And as for the archers, the geometry of the cave provided a natural shield. To shoot into the cave from the valley floor, you have to aim almost straight up. Gravity becomes the enemy of the projectile. This was the trap. Pelayo wasn't hiding, he was baiting. By positioning himself in the cave, he was inviting Alcama to come and get him. He was betting everything on the arrogance of his enemy. He knew they wouldn't stop to think about the terrain. He knew they would see a trapped rat and reach in to crush it. And he was right. In the spring of 722, the Umayyad army entered the valley. They brought with them Bishop Oppas, a high-ranking churchman who had collaborated with the invaders. Oppas was there to offer Pelayo one last chance to surrender, to appeal to his reason. But reason had left the building a long time ago. The stage was set not for a negotiation, but for a collision between two worlds, the irresistible force of the Caliphate and the immovable object of the Asturian mountains. Before the first arrow was loosed, the Umayyad general Alcama decided to play his political trump card. He did not send a warrior to the base of the cave. He sent a priest. Riding forward on a mule dressed in the finery of his office was Bishop Oppas. Oppas is one of the most fascinating and reviled figures in Spanish history. He was the son of a previous king, a man of high noble birth and a prince of the church. But to the men hiding in the cave, he was something else entirely, a collaborator. Oppas represented the faction of Visigoths who had decided that it was better to be a live servant than a dead king. He had kept his wealth, his position, and his head by bowing to the new masters in Cordoba. He rode up to the mouth of the gorge, within shouting distance of Pelayo. The historical chronicles, specifically the Chronicle of Alfonso III, record the conversation that followed. While we must always be sceptical of speeches recorded years later, the essence of this dialogue captures the soul of the conflict perfectly. Oppas didn't threaten Pelayo. He tried to seduce him with logic. He shouted up to the cave, "Pelayo, my brother, you're a wise man. You know the reality of our situation. The entire army of the Goths, with all their chivalry and strength, could not stand against the Ishmaelites. Every great city in Spain has fallen. How can you, on this little mountain, hope to succeed where an entire kingdom failed? It was a seductive argument. It was the voice of reason. Oppas offered him a deal. Come down, pledge loyalty to the Caliphate, and you will be allowed to govern this region as a friend of Cordoba. You will be rich. You will be safe. You will have a future. For the starving men in the cave, shivering in the damp cold, this offer must have been incredibly tempting. Why die for a kingdom that no longer exists? Why not take the deal? But Pelayo's response changed history. He didn't answer with military statistics. He answered with theology and defiance. Standing at the mouth of the cave, looking down at the bishop who had sold his soul, Pelayo shouted back, "Have you not read in the Holy Scriptures that the Church of the Lord is like a mustard seed? Being the smallest of all, it grows to be greater than all." He continued, his voice echoing off the limestone walls, "I will not associate with the Arabs in friendship, nor will I submit to their rule. For we rely on the mercy of God that, from this little mountain, the salvation of Spain will arise. From this little mountain." With those words, Pelayo drew a line in the sand, or rather, in the rock. He rejected the new normal. He declared that the conquest was not a permanent reality, but a temporary tribulation. Oppas, realizing that words had failed, turned his mule around and rode back to General Alcamar. The bishop's report was brief and chilling. "He will not surrender," Oppas told the general. "You must fight, but be careful, for only God knows what the outcome will be." Alcamar, the seasoned commander, likely sneered. He had heard enough speeches. He looked up at the cave, at the sheer cliffs, and at the ragtag group of rebels. He didn't see a mustard seed of resistance. He saw a target practice. He raised his hand, the drums of war began to beat, and the order was given. Slings and arrows! The vanguard of the Umayyad army, consisting of slingers and archers, moved into position. Their job was to suppress the rebels, to rain death into the cave mouth so the heavy infantry could storm the slope. It was a standard tactic. It had worked in 100 sieges before, but as the first volley of arrows blackened the sky, the men in the valley were about to learn a lesson in physics. The cave of Covadonga is not a deep, flat tunnel, it is a shallow overhang. When you shoot an arrow from below at a steep angle, if you miss the target, even by a few inches, the arrow hits the stone ceiling of the overhang. And what happens when a high-velocity projectile hits hard stone at an acute angle? It doesn't stick, it ricochets. The chronicles say that the arrows returned against those who shot them. While medieval writers called this a miracle of God, modern ballistics calls it geometry. The Umayyad archers were firing into a stone bowl. The arrows shattered, bounced, and rained back down onto the tightly packed ranks of their own soldiers. Panic rippled through the front lines. Men were being struck by their own friendly fire. They looked up, confused, shielding their eyes from the rebounding hail, and in that moment of confusion, while the monster was blinking, Pelayo gave the signal. From the trees, from the ridges, and from the cave itself, the wild donkeys charged. When the Asturians charged, they didn't come out like a disciplined Roman legion. They poured out of the cave and the surrounding forests like a landslide. The psychological shock to the Umayyad frontline was total. One moment they were dodging their own arrows, the next, men with swords, axes, and rocks were on top of them. But the 300 men in the cave were just the bait. The real teeth of the trap were hidden higher up. Pelayo knew he couldn't beat the Umayyad heavy infantry man to man on flat ground, so he turned the landscape itself into ammunition. Along the high ridges of the gorge, hidden in the thick morning mist, were the rest of his forces, villagers, farmers, and other refugees. They had spent days loosening massive boulders and piling up heavy tree trunks. As soon as the chaos erupted at the cave mouth, the signal was given. The ridges exploded. Tons of rock and timber came crashing down into the narrow valley floor. Imagine the scene inside that gorge. The Umayyad army was packed shoulder to shoulder, a river of steel and flesh confined by stone walls. When the rocks fell, there was nowhere to dodge. There was no formation to hold. The rearguard was still pushing forward, unaware of the disaster at the front, while the vanguard was trying to push back to escape the slaughter. The result was a crush. Men were trampled by their own horses. The famed discipline of the Caliphate's army evaporated in seconds. This is the brutal mathematics of the killing box. In a space 10 meters wide, having 10,000 soldiers is not an advantage, it is a liability. Only the first row can fight. The rest are just waiting to die. The Asturians, light on their feet and knowing every foothold of the terrain, moved through the chaos like wolves in a sheep pen. They struck from above, from the sides and from the front. They targeted the officers, the banners and the horses. In the centre of this maelstrom was General Alcama. To his credit, he didn't run. He tried to rally his men to create space for a counterattack. But a general in a gorge is just another man on a horse. The chronicles state that Alcama fell in the thick of the fighting, cut down by the very wild donkeys he had mocked. The death of Alcama was the final nail in the coffin. In ancient and medieval warfare, the army is the general. When the head is cut off, the body dies. Word of his death rippled through the panic-stricken ranks like an electric shock. Alcama is dead! The general is fallen! The will to fight vanished. The Umayyad soldiers, who had conquered half the world, dropped their shields and turned to run. But running was just as dangerous as fighting. The path back was blocked by their own reinforcements and the piles of debris raining down from the cliffs. The retreat turned into a rout. It is important to emphasize that this wasn't a battle in the traditional sense. It was an extermination. The Asturians were venting years of humiliation, grief and loss. They fought with the ferocity of men defending their last inch of earth. The river Deva, which runs through the valley, was said to have run red for days. By the time the sun hit the bottom of the gorge, the invincible army was shattered. The survivors, those lucky enough to escape the killing box, fled east, desperate to get out of the mountains. They thought they had escaped hell. They were wrong. They were just moving to the second circle of it. For Pelayo, standing amidst the wreckage of the greatest army of his age, this was vindication. The wild donkeys had kicked back, but he knew the job wasn't done. You don't just wound a beast like the Umayyad Caliphate. You have to make sure it doesn't come back. The chase was on. The survivors of the slaughter at Covadonga didn't regroup. They ran. The remnants of the Umayyad force, likely numbering in the thousands, fled east through the high passes of the Picos de Europa. They were terrified, leaderless, and completely lost in a labyrinth of fog and stone. Their goal was to reach the Libana Valley, a flatter region where their cavalry might stand a chance, or at least where they could find a road back to the safety of the south. But the mountains weren't done with them yet. The retreat took them through a place called Cosgaya. Even today, this is a treacherous landscape of unstable slopes and river gorges. In the year 722, it was a death trap. Historical chronicles describe a scene of biblical destruction. As the retreating column marched along a narrow track next to the river Deva, the earth beneath them began to groan. Whether it was caused by the heavy rains that often plague this region, or the sheer vibration and weight of thousands of panicked men and horses stomping on loose limestone, the result was catastrophic. The side of the mountain sheared off. A massive landslide roared down the slopes. It wasn't just rocks, it was the mountain itself collapsing. The Chronicle of Alfonso III, written nearly 2 centuries later, describes it with religious awe. The mountain came down upon them and crushed them, and they were buried there. It goes on to say that 63,000 men were killed, a number that is almost certainly an exaggeration typical of medieval writers. But the core truth remains: the army was erased. For the Christian chroniclers, this was the hand of God. Just as the Red Sea closed over Pharaoh's army, the Picos de Europa closed over the Umayyads. It validated their cause. It proved that the land itself was rejecting the invader. From a modern historical perspective, we see a brutal collision of geology and warfare. A routed army, unfamiliar with the terrain, forced onto unstable ground during the wet season, is a recipe for a landslide. The devastation was total. The river Deva was reportedly dammed by the debris and the bodies, creating a gruesome blockage that took days to clear. This event at Cosgaya is crucial because it turned a defeat into an annihilation. If these thousands of soldiers had escaped, they could have regrouped. They could have returned to Cordoba, gathered reinforcements, and marched back the next summer with a map and a better plan. But they didn't return. The entire expeditionary force of General Alcama vanished. For the Umayyad governors in the south, the silence from the north must have been deafening. An army marched out and simply ceased to exist. No messengers returned. No survivors came limping back to tell the tale. The wild donkeys hadn't just bitten, they had devoured the lion whole. This total destruction created a psychological barrier. The mountains of Asturias were no longer just insignificant, They were cursed. They were a graveyard. The Umayyad military, pragmatic to the core, looked at the cost-benefit analysis and decided, never again. They would launch raids in the future, yes, but never again would they try to conquer these peaks with the intent of permanent occupation. The landslide at Cosgaya brought Pelayo something more valuable than gold: security. It drew a permanent border between the Islamic south and the Christian north. It allowed the tiny seed of resistance to take root without fear of being immediately dug up. Back in the cave of Covadonga, the victory was complete. The immediate threat was gone. But Pelayo knew that winning one battle doesn't make a kingdom. He had to secure his legacy, and to do that, he had to deal with the last loose end of the old regime, Governor Munuza. While the landslides were burying the army of the Caliphate in the mountains, Governor Munuza was sitting in his palace in the coastal city of Gijon waiting for good news. He expected a messenger to arrive with Pelayo's head in a bag. Instead, he got silence. And then, he got rumours. Terrified survivors from the periphery of the battle began to trickle into the city whispering about a massacre, about mountains falling from the sky, and about a ghost army that couldn't be killed. Munuza realised instantly that the game was up. He was a politician, and he knew how to read the wind. The wind had changed. The countryside, which had been passive under his rule, was suddenly hostile. The locals were looking at him differently. The fear was gone from their eyes, replaced by something far more dangerous: hope. He knew that Gijon, a port city, was indefensible against a guerrilla force that owned the surrounding highlands. If he stayed, he would be besieged. So Munuza did what Alcama's army had tried to do. He ran. He gathered his treasury, his personal guard, and likely Pelayo's sister, if she was indeed still his captive, and fled south. His plan was to reach the safety of the Meseta, the central plateau where the cavalry of the Emirates still ruled supreme. But Pelayo was not just a warrior, he was now a hunter. He had anticipated Munuza's move. The wild donkeys came down from the peaks, moving faster through the familiar valleys than Munuza could move along the Roman roads. The interception took place at a valley called Olalies. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. Munuza, the man who had tried to erase Pelayo's lineage, the man who represented the humiliation of the Visigoth nobility, found himself cornered. History is vague on the exact details of his death. Some say he was killed in the skirmish, others say he was captured and executed, but the outcome was final. Munuza died on the road, fleeing the kingdom he thought he owned. With Munuza dead and Alcama buried, the slate was wiped clean. There was not a single active Umayyad combat unit left in Asturias. The impossible had happened. In a few weeks, a group of refugees had decapitated the provincial government and annihilated the expeditionary army. Now, the silence in the mountains wasn't one of fear, it was one of victory. The rebels gathered again, perhaps in the same field near Cangas de Onís where they had first conspired. But this time, the mood was different. They weren't fugitives anymore. They were conquerors. It was time to formalise what they had done. They didn't have a golden crown. They didn't have a cathedral. They didn't have the Pope to bless them. They went back to their roots. The Visigoths were a Germanic people, and their traditions were forged in iron and blood. According to the ancient custom of their ancestors, the warriors took their leader and raised him up on a shield. They lifted Pelayo high above their heads, shouting his name, proclaiming him king. It was a raw, primitive coronation. There were no velvet robes, only the battered armour of survivors. This moment marked the birth of the Kingdom of Asturias. It was a tiny kingdom, barely a speck on the map, consisting of a few valleys and a lot of rocks. But it was free. Pelayo, the man who had been a hostage in Cordoba, was now the first independent Christian king in the Iberian Peninsula since the collapse of 711. He established his capital at Cangas de Onís. It was a humble village compared to the marble splendour of Cordoba, but it had one advantage. It was his. This coronation was more than just a ceremony, it was a political earthquake. It sent a message to the rest of Europe and to the Caliphate. We are still here. The Umayyads, reeling from the loss of their army, decided to leave this thorny little kingdom alone. They categorised Asturias as Dar al-Harb, the House of War, a hostile territory not worth the blood it cost to take. They turned their attention to easier targets in France. a decision that would eventually lead them to another defeat at the Battle of Tours 10 years later. But for Pelayo, the war was effectively over. He would rule for another 15 years, not as a warlord but as a monarch. He would die in his bed in 737 AD, a rare feat for a man in his line of work. But his true legacy wasn't the crown he wore, it was the chain reaction he started. When Don Pelayo died in 737 AD, by all rights, his kingdom should have died with him. History is littered with charismatic rebel leaders who win a few battles, but whose movements disintegrate the moment they are put in the ground. The kingdom of Asturias was still just a fragile embryo. It was poor, underpopulated, and completely surrounded by the most advanced superpower on Earth. But Asturias didn't die. It grew, and it grew because Pelayo had left behind something more powerful than an army. He left a template for survival. The survival of this impossible kingdom relied on a strategy that was as brutal as it was brilliant. It wasn't about holding territory, it was about weaponizing emptiness. Pelayo's successors, particularly his son-in-law Alfonso I, realized that they could not defend the open plains south of the mountains. If the Umayyads marched north with a full army, the Asturians would lose every time on flat ground. So they created a shield of nothingness. Historians call it the Desert of the Duero. The Asturian kings launched raids south into the Duero River basin, but they didn't conquer the towns to rule them, they conquered them to empty them. They killed the local garrisons, burned the crops, and forcibly migrated the Christian population back north into the mountains. They turned a massive strip of land between the Kingdom of Asturias and the Caliphate into a no-man's land. It was a scorched earth policy on a continental scale. For nearly a century, this buffer zone remained depopulated. Any Umayyad army trying to march north to crush Asturias would have to cross hundreds of miles of wasteland with no food, no water, and no plunder. By the time they reached the mountains, they would be starving and exhausted, perfect targets for an ambush. This strategic buffer allowed the Kingdom of Asturias to incubate. Behind the safety of the mountains and the desert, a new society began to form. It was a fusion of Visigothic nobility and local mountaineer toughness. They built churches that looked like fortresses. They wrote laws. They began to see themselves not just as rebels, but as the legitimate heirs to the Roman and Visigothic tradition. While the rest of Europe was sinking into the Dark Ages, this tiny pocket of resistance became an ark. It preserved the culture, the religion, and the identity of a lost Spain. It became a beacon. Christians from the south, tired of living as second-class citizens under Islamic rule, migrated north. They brought with them skills, art, and a burning desire for reclamation. The Umayyad Caliphate, meanwhile, was distracted by its own internal problems, civil wars, Berber revolts, and the logistical nightmare of running an empire that spanned 3 continents. They looked at the north and saw only poverty and rocks. They didn't see the cancer growing on their flank. They didn't realise that the wild donkeys had evolved into wolves. By the 9th century, the Kingdom of Asturias was no longer hiding. It was pushing back. It moved its capital from the caves of Cangastionis to the city of Oviedo. It began to recolonise the lands it had once emptied. The Reconquista had shifted from a desperate defence into a slow, grinding offence. This is the true miracle of Covadonga. It wasn't just that 300 men won a battle, it was that they bought enough time for a nation to be born. If Pelayo had fallen in that cave, there would have been no Kingdom of Asturias. Without Asturias, there would be no Leon, no Castile, no Portugal, and no Spain. The entire history of the Western world turned on the pivot of that single rainy afternoon in the mountains, and as the centuries rolled on, the memory of Covadonga was transformed. It ceased to be a tactical ambush and became a national myth. The cave became a shrine. Pelayo became a saint in armour. The victory was proof that no matter how dark the night or how powerful the enemy, resistance is never futile. But to truly understand the scale of what began there, we have to fast forward. We have to look at the long road that stretches from the cave of Covadonga in 722 to the gates of Granada in 1492. It is terrifying to think how thin the thread of history actually is. If General Alcama had been a little more patient, if a stray arrow had struck Pelayo in the throat, or if the rocks at Cosgaya had held firm just a few seconds longer, the world we live in today would not exist. Historians often play the what-if game, and the Battle of Covadonga is one of the biggest what-ifs of all time. Without this victory, Islamic rule over the Iberian Peninsula would likely have become absolute. There would have been no Kingdom of Asturias to push south. There would have been no Portugal, no Spain, and without Spain there would have been no Queen Isabella in 1492 to finance a crazy Genovese sailor named Christopher Columbus. The languages, religions and cultures of the entire Americas would be unrecognizable. The geopolitical map of the modern world was drawn in that cave. But Pelayo didn't know any of that. He wasn't fighting for the discovery of the new world, he was fighting for his home. The war he started, the Reconquista, would last for 770 years. It is the longest war in human history. It was a grind of centuries, fought by generations of kings and queens who looked back at that cave as their spiritual origin. When the Catholic monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella, finally conquered Granada in 1492 and ended Islamic rule in Spain, they didn't see it as a new conquest. They saw it as the completion of the mission Pelayo started. Today, if you travel to the Picos de Europa, you can still visit the Holy Cave. It is a place of profound silence, broken only by the sound of the waterfall crashing into the pool below. It has become a sanctuary, a cathedral of nature. Inside, carved into the rock wall, is a simple tomb. The inscription on the tomb of King Pelayo reads, "Here lies King Pelayo of Oviedo. It was he who, in this marvellous place, began a new reign that arose from the ashes. It is a humble resting place for a man who saved a civilization." But perhaps that is fitting. Pelayo was not a man of palaces, he was a man of the mountains. He reminds us that history is not always made by the massive empires or the invincible armies. Sometimes it is made by a handful of people backed into a corner who look at the impossible odds stacked against them and simply say, no. The Battle of Covadonga teaches us that even when the map is painted in the colours of the enemy, and even when the experts say that all hope is lost, as long as there's one mustard seed of resistance left, the story isn't over. A single spark protected in a dark cave can eventually burn down a forest. If you've made it this far, you're clearly someone who values the deep, often overlooked stories that define who we are. If this story of survival and defiance resonated with you, please give this video a like. It truly helps these stories reach more people. And don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next deep dive into history's turning points. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you think the Reconquista was inevitable, or was Pelayo's victory truly a miracle? Let the debate begin below. If you want to understand what happened after the Reconquista, click the video on your screen right now to see how the Spanish Empire rose to rule the world and how it eventually fell. I'll see you there.